morning. Good morning. I'm Rita Prangle, and I'll be your worship leader this morning as we celebrate the 203rd birthday of Charles Darwin, and we're celebrating, of course, science and reason, which we Unitarians believe in very strongly. We have a few announcements. Also, if we have any visitors, we'd be happy if you sign our guest book, and please do join us after the service for refreshments in the back. We have a nice cake to celebrate Darwin's birthday. And everybody wants to turn off your cell phones, please. Although cooperative care is in the moving process this month, they continue to accept donations of non-perishable food items and soap, toothpaste, and brushes, clothes, etc. The encirclement of the building ceremony will be held on Monday, the 27th at 11 o'clock, and the grand opening will be held at 11 o'clock on Wednesday, the 29th. The doors will be open to clients. There's a typo here. The doors will be open to clients on March 1st. The reception for the Black History Month art exhibit at the Heritage Center was well attended, and people seemed to have a good time. Thanks to Ivy for organizing the exhibit and reception and for displaying her always wonderful art. Speaking of very fine art, Christiana Harkins and Sherry Rogers also exhibited pieces. The exhibit will be at the Heritage Center through February, Black History Month. We recommend you stop by if you haven't already. Also, we have another announcement. Would you like to talk about the event on, I'm blanking out here, in Colorado Springs, the music event. This is for one or two of us that are socially progressive.
On February 22nd, Roy Zimmerman will be playing at the Stargazers Theater. Previously, he played at High Plains Unitarian Universalist Church up in Colorado Springs. And the event is also a organizing event for all social progressives to come bring a booth and speak about what their organizations do. I'll be running a voter registration drive at the event. And Roy Zimmerman's music, if you don't know who he is, you can find it on YouTube very easily. His music really does speak to people, and it's about social progress.
And he's a very good musician.
Yes,
as well.
yes he is.
Okay. Would you like the chalice? We light this chalice to celebrate the inherent worth and dignity of every person, to reaffirm the historic pledge of liberal religion to seek that justice which transcends mere legality and moves toward the resolution of true equality, and to share that love which is ultimately beyond even our cherished reason, that love which unites us. We're going to have a little opening music by Myrna this morning. We're not going to be singing any hymns, but I've asked Myrna to play selections that came from Charles Darwin's time, and she's selected some pieces from Chopin. I have a little reading that I excerpted from the article I saw in the Huffington Post. It's called America's Darwin Problem by Kenneth Miller, professor of biology at Brown University. But before that, I would just like to mention, thinking about Darwin Day, I remember this from years ago. My parents were atheists, but my mom did take us around to different churches because they didn't want us to be totally ignorant. And my mom and I were at a meeting at the Presbyterian Church, and this was probably in 1955. And the minister talked about evolution, and he said that evolution didn't have to conflict with religion, that, people can interpret the Bible, don't have to interpret the Bible literally. So, 6 days doesn't mean 6 24-hour days. And one of the church elders got up at that point and said, well, this is too deep for me. I just can't fathom that we're related to monkeys, and I'm going to have to leave. My mom had to explain to me later exactly what the problem was. And I would never have dreamed that we would be still having this discussion all these years later. And it is a little scary, and I think it's just important that we let our feelings and thoughts be known to others. Anyway, this is from the article. Dr. Miller says, in America today, anti-evolutionism matters because it has become the vanguard of a genuine anti-science movement. First, it threatens the future of American scientific leadership in an increasingly competitive world. Second, and in my view, more important, our problem with science constrains and narrows our views and vision of the world. Evolution isn't just a story about where we came from. It's an epic at the center of life itself. Far from robbing our lives of meaning, it instills an appreciation for the beautiful, enduring, and ultimately triumphant fabric of life that covers our planet. Understanding that doesn't demean human life, it enhances it. We may be animals, but we're not just animals. We are the only ones who can truly appreciate, as Darwin put it, that there is a grandeur in this view of life. And indeed there is. To accept evolution isn't just to acknowledge the obvious, that the evidence behind it is overwhelming. It is to open one's eyes to the endless beauty that life has generated and continues to produce. It is to become a knowing participant in the truest sense of the living world of which we are all a part. And now I'm going to turn this over to our speaker, Professor Mark Pratarelli, and Mark is going to talk about Charles Darwin and his life and times.
Not dead yet.
Oh. That's what happens when you try composing something at midnight. I found the hat.
Oh,
Pretty much. I tried to get, I told Rita I would try to get a beard, couldn't find a beard. Friday, I was at a thrift store in Denver, and I almost bought a 4-foot-tall doll to shave off all her silver hair. But that wasn't gonna work either, and I couldn't find the clothes. Maybe next year I'll have it. But I did get, and I thought about growing the beard, but it at me.
I just thought you were younger.
Oh, thank you. My alternative was to invite him to come up and do the titles. Don't they look so similar? Okay, well, for those of you who aren't familiar with Charles Darwin, there he is. And what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today, well, that's interesting. It kind of split up the word evolution.
Mark Frederelli.
Okay, yeah, so we're going to talk about evolution. There's two things we're going to talk about. One is, it's Darwin Day, so we want to talk a little bit about that. But more importantly, I think what we're most interested in is that it's what he did that made a difference. It's that theory, and what many of us don't even consider it a theory anymore. Most biologists don't consider it a theory. They believe it's now natural law. After 160 years, of trying to disprove it, and it resists that, it's a fairly decent bet that it's probably going to be around for quite a while. Okay, so, and by the way, my style is fairly informal. So if you got a question, just stop me in the middle and I'll be happy to answer it. So I want to talk first really briefly about the importance of revolutions, okay? Because that's the essence of what Charles Darwin did for us. It was set up a revolution. You can all hear me fine. I don't have to speak into this. Okay. So that's essentially what Charles Darwin did for us, is to set up one of the most recent revolutions. And this gentleman here, Thomas Kuhn, died a few years ago, but he's very, very important in all the scientific disciplines. Because Kuhn wrote a wonderful book in 1970, and then again, a better version, 77, I think, about scientific revolutions, okay? And what he pointed out in his basic premise is that, look, they happen, but they take a long time to happen. And they're not, they can establish themselves as long as the old guard is there. There's a group of people thinking the same way. It may be an entrenched way of thinking. So, and science basically has that history, all the way back to times of Aristotle and Plato. And then Copernicus, the Copernican revolution, then Galileo, the impact he had, and Descartes, people like this. So then we get to Darwin, obviously, and he gives us probably the most profound revolution in all of science. I am in that camp of people who think that his contribution was far greater than even Einstein's contribution. So, and it remains so today. So, okay, so true revolutions in science are hard to come by, and they take generations to mature. Let's see. Okay, so here's a nice little representation of, over time here, the effect on reason of changes in the way we think. If I were to have extended this way back out, anthropologists, this is all digested from anthropology research. There's actually a couple of bumps prior to this. This isn't the first revolution, the Renaissance, that brought us out of the Dark Ages. Prior to this, way back in time, there's a couple of really small bumps. One of them for the discovery of fire. All right, because fire gave us a quantum leap in our ability to succeed. And then later on, there was obviously the revolution we call agriculture. And that allowed us to produce far more people, for a unit of energy expended than hunting and gathering would have done. So this tells you a little bit about what happened with the Renaissance. There was a quantum shift over a period of about 100, 150 years that it legitimized discussion, open discussion. Science became more fashionable. Prior to that, of course, most of us know the history pretty well, and religion pretty much ruled the day, which is, I love that bumper sticker, and someday I'll find it and buy it. But when religion, I think it says something like, when religion ruled the day, it was called the Dark Ages. All right. Okay, so after the Renaissance, there is actually another revolution, and that is the Industrial Revolution, of which Darwin is actually really near the onset of it. And we'll talk a little more about this bump later, because that has more to do with the modern communication, 20th century communications revolution that we've had, the computers and things like this, the internet, your smartphones, that sort of thing. So, but it's not nearly the kind of quantum shift in thinking that we've had since the Renaissance. Darwin made a big, big change for us, and that's what I'll be talking about. What is it that he allowed us to talk about? Okay.
Mark, what were the dates of the Industrial Revolution?
it depends on what you look at. You can actually find different onset times. It depends on what a particular historian considers the beginning of industry, mass production, replaceable parts, things like that. So there's some, I like the people who say, well, it was the 19th century, somewhere in the 19th century. It could have been early on, it could have been later. It just depends on what you choose to say, this is the point. So, but there's no question that it starts right sometime after the French Revolution, so beginning of the 19th century. And by the time we get to the 1900s, right, gosh, the 1900s like it was eons ago, right? In the 21st century now. By the time you get to the 1900s, of course, now you have Henry Ford. I mean, they've really put science to work in industry, right? So, okay, so Darwin's social consequences. A couple of them here we're going to talk about. He left his instructions to his wife, Emma, that his life's work should be published after his death. He'd actually had a fairly coherent version of the theory of natural selection. We use the word evolution for short, but the word evolution is abused all the time. I hear students, I hear people on the radio talk about their personal evolution. Well, you don't evolve, you actually develop. When you're born, you're an organism and you develop over time. You don't evolve. Evolve would mean you end up with 3 horns and an arm sticking out of your chest or something like that. So, but the term is so misused that in science we like to use the term natural selection. We'll talk about it a little bit later. But I put that up there first because I think it speaks louder than anything else about Darwin's appreciation for the times that he was writing and working in. That he had a somewhat religious family. His father was more religious than his own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. Erasmus Darwin was an atheist. And in fact, Erasmus Darwin, who Charles Darwin, the grandson, never met. I think he died about 5, 6, 7 years before Charles Darwin was born. But Erasmus Darwin had his own theory of evolution, believe it or not. He actually developed one. So it wasn't completely. When we think about Charles Darwin, I don't want you to think that this guy this is an incredible genius and he just thought it all up. No, actually Aristotle had a theory of evolution. It wasn't very good, but it's a theory of evolution. Lamarck had a theory of evolution that kind of fell by the wayside about 100 years prior to Erasmus Darwin. And of course, Erasmus Darwin had a theory of his own, which was actually reasonably close to what Darwin came up with. As it is, we come to find out, there's just a couple of little secrets that occurred to Charles Darwin, and one of them we have a guy named Thomas Malthus to thank. And in fact, it's in the first chapter of Origin of Species. How many of you read Origin of Species? Okay. You know, I think it's as important to read that as Henry David Thoreau or something like that. So, but in the first chapter, Darwin talks about, and it's a very poetic way that he puts it. He says, "It was upon reading the works of the Honorable Sir Thomas Malthus that it occurred to me that the secret, the driving force that changes species for the better, improves upon them, is competition of all things." And that competition, by the way, is interestingly enough what, from my talking with religious people who have an issue with evolution theory, that's the problem. They don't like competition. They think it's evil. It's a sin to compete, to be, I'm better than you kind of thing. You know, it's kind of silly, but we're talking about nature itself, right? The repercussions from the religious sector is what I was getting at there. The first 600 to 700 copies sold on the first day were burned. There were several organized religious kind of things going on, and they just went out and bought a whole bunch of the books and burned them. One of the events that's talked about was a public book burning. So Darwin, and this is day one. So from the first print in 1859, there was only about 300 copies left by the end of 24 hours. So isn't that phenomenal? Now, of course, what happens at the end of the story really is we have a guy named Alfred Russel Wallace to thank. He was a younger gentleman that came upon the same basic mechanism for the origination of new species. How do new species come to be? And he was actually in the Amazon, going up with a boat up the Amazon River, it occurred to him there, and he did some writing. He sends a letter to Charles Darwin in England, and when Darwin and Huxley and a variety of their friends all realized what had happened, because there's no question in history, in the historical annals, there's no question that Charles Darwin came up with a theory. He'd done that probably about 20 years earlier, somewhere in the 1840-ish, okay, about 20 years before Origin of Species is published. But in 1858, the year before his book comes out, he publishes a paper, very famous paper, short and sweet actually, very elegant, with Russell Wallace as the co-principal investigator. And together, they announced the theory of natural selection. Okay? Interestingly enough, another little kind of side thing about Darwin, I'm kind of a Darwin buff by history, and I love history and stuff like that. It's one of the interesting little side things of Darwin. His personality-wise, is a very shy person, very cloistered. He liked to stay at home a lot. He wasn't very big in terms of getting out and socializing with people. And in fact, he never actually defended his own, he never introduced his own theory and defended it in public. That was done by Huxley. Okay, and then he basically, as the story goes, he waited at home, and then they all came back together after it had been introduced and accepted by the people that were in the know and rejected by the religious right that was there. I think at I can't remember his name right now. There was an archbishop that was very adamant that this was going to be the end of the world, and this Darwin is a heretic, and all this kind of wonderful stuff. And he actually gets up and he does this big lecture, takes over the state and starts to lecture about how this theory is completely goofy. We don't come from monkeys, which tells you right away that the gentleman never ever bothered to read the book. Okay, this is happening today, by the way. In 2007, I was on sabbatical in Italy, and the Pope wrote an article. No, the Pope didn't write an article. They reported something that the Pope said, and he said Darwin's theory was complete rubbish. And he says, this is, and I quote, he says, Darwin's theory tries to explain the meaning of life. Well, how many of you read just the title? So Brunetto Chiarelli, my host during my sabbatical, and I wrote a short little letter to the editor for the Florentine paper there, and said, clearly this Pope doesn't read. Because if he had even read the title of the book, he would know it's titled On the Origin of Species, not the origins of life. But that's a common mistake that I see and hear even to this day, among students in some cases. Okay. Right, so what is man's place in the universe? I hesitate to use the word man, but it's so commonplace. But we're talking about humans' place in the universe, obviously. Natural selection changed the nature of social and political discussion. Okay? Charles Darwin didn't do that, because Charles Darwin just didn't talk. He didn't go out into public. He wasn't very strong about that sort of thing. He let his colleagues do most of that work for him. But the theory itself is what opened up, and what it means, okay, opened up a whole new dialogue. It became permissible, okay, and we're already in the Renaissance, post-Renaissance period here. So, but the theory of natural selection, let's say, lays to rest because it was scientifically sound. There was ample evidence. I mean, how else do you explain finding fossilized clams at 15,000 feet above the ocean in the Andes? Okay, unless geology is changing the form of the planet and that sort of thing. What was once down at the ocean is now up in the... that's right here, right? And we were just hiking out at the lake the other day, and we found a couple of little clam fossils, which are dated, I think, to around... a fellow at CSU Pueblo told me they were around 6 to 6.5 million years old. The clams that you find walking around in the shale in Pueblo West. So, a rational alternative to religious mythology and the nonsense that is known as divine intervention. Okay, as we'll come to find out, concepts like divine intervention were really mechanisms that society used, pre-scientific societies had used, to explain what, in their terms, was the unexplainable. All right? And that's something that you really have to think hard, not to fault people who came up with these kinds of ideas. That's all they could do. All right? I mean, every one of us probably, if we have an accident or something catastrophic happens to us, we say, oh, why me? Well, that's the same kind of thinking. Obviously, if you sat down, you rationalized it all, you would realize, well, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, I was going a little too fast, a little too slow, it's a chance that I was there, so that sort of. To this day, when I get on an airplane, not that every one of you do this too, the morning I'm driving to the airport, I'm thinking, I wonder if this is the one. So you always make sure you've got clean underwear on, because you're going to have to pick through the pocket. But you know what? I'd never crashed once. But I still think that, okay? So, all right. Dualism ceases to be unchecked. This is a really important event, let's say, that the dualism that was really established the paradigm, the scientific and moral paradigm for the better part of 3,000 years, was that man and nature were separate things. Man was a special creation, okay? And it doesn't matter whether you look at the Bible, the Quran, or anything, it makes no difference. They all say exactly the same thing. Man is a special creation of God. All right? So humanity and nature are one and the same thing is essentially what natural selection theory says. It does not say that we came from monkeys. It says we have common ancestors with something prior to monkeys, okay? About 2 years ago. Well, they found it several years ago, but they just reported for the first time 2 years back in 2010. They discovered the most recent hominid species, and he had not just opposable thumbs, but opposable toes, meaning that he spent time foraging in the trees and foraging on the ground. But he was an upright walking hominid. That was, prior to that, unknown to us. So, okay, so here we go. At the end of the day, irrational thought wins. Sadly, that's true. Okay, we have a long way to go still till we achieve, let's say, global enlightenment. I don't know any other way to put it, but that's essentially what we're hoping to get. I'm hoping for global enlightenment. As many of you know, I'm very involved in the environmental issues and stuff, and how do we become sustainable? How do we make our species do something that's completely unnatural for us? Okay, because remember, like all other organisms, what we are tuned to do, what our brains are designed to do, is live out the end of the day, the end of the week, the end of the month or year, live out our lives, okay? So the moment is important, which means we're tuned towards short-term interests, unfortunately. Long-term means geologic time, over many, many, many generations. And we don't think that way. None of us is planning for the welfare of our, remember, per millennium there's 60 generations. So none of us is thinking about the year 3000, all right? 60 generations later. Never mind that genetics tells us that after 6 generations, it doesn't make a difference who your ancestor was, because you are statistically related to the person sitting next to you, all right? May not have the same family name. So George Bush talks about some family member that came over on the Mayflower, supposedly. Fortunately, that's a whole different set of genes. Okay, George Bush's genes are very different ones. I had to throw that in there. No day is complete without a little political. So, okay, and so this is where we're at today. We're in this period right here, okay? We're hoping to get up here sometime, where one would be 100% reason and enlightenment. But we're somewhere in this range right in here, probably, right now. And I'll talk a little bit now about the sorts of things that tell us that we're in a type of new modern revolution. It's a revolution on top of a revolution, so to speak. And we'll be mentioning people like, Richard Dawkins or Big Stegner that was here recently. So these people would have been burned at the stake just a few years ago. And while there's actually parts of the planet where they would still be burned at the stake. So, are we due for another revolution? Well, maybe. There are some signs, as I indicated. Darwin made it safe for others to say that most religious belief is merely delusion. How many of you had a chance to read Richard Dawkins' this penultimate book, actually? He's got a new one out called The God Delusion. He's a little over the top for me, but I do like the way he organized the 6 different stages or levels, let's say, of belief. Where at the far low end is people who are extremely devout and blind faith sort of thing. And at the top end, it would be the atheist. And most of us, as he points out, including himself, are probably at level 5, or what we call agnostics. But we're agnostics who lean toward the atheist side because we don't find any credible evidence to support believing in these mythologies. So that's important about Darwin's theory. It makes it took 100 years, but it makes it not just legitimate, but relatively safe. In other words, you're going to have a sensitive public that's going to be receptive to the kinds of things that Richard Dawkins, or how many of you were here for Rick Steiner's talk a few months back? Oh, good, many of you. Those kinds of issues we can sit and listen to them. So I was joking with a friend last night at dinner that he asked me, what are you talking about tomorrow? Because he knew I just came back from Denver, gave a talk the other day. And I said, well, it's Darwin Day, so I'm going to get a chance I've never had a chance to speak about Darwin himself, so I'm going to have a chance to talk about that. He said, are you going to get shot? I said, no, these are UU people. I said, but you'll come to think of it, Richard, they did put it in the paper. So,
Yeah.
so we could be visited by others, I don't know. Let's hope not. There are better odds that suggest to us that we're continuing on this path, slowly but surely, toward ultimate enlightenment. But that there's, like I said, there's still drawbacks. It's certainly more plausible than the 2012 hypothesis. I had a student who said to me not too long ago, do I have to turn the paper in since next year is the last year? And I won't graduate in time. I said, when are you graduating? He says, spring of 2013. Theoretically, there won't be any. I said, yeah, you're right, don't turn the paper in. I'll just leave it there now. So, that's creative thinking. And of course, it's better odds than Jesus' second coming. Okay. So, we are in this age of reason. We have been. It began by revolutionizing the natural sciences and medicine. That's the first thing that natural selection theory did. Geology and biology were the first to change. They experienced the revolutionary paradigm shift that Thomas Edison talks about. After that, another point here. It took a few more years, but certainly by the 20th century, by the turn of the century, the rest of the natural sciences, physics and others have turned a corner as well. And of course, assistance to that came from Einstein, who about the turn of the century is coming up with a new quantum theory. Right? 150 years later, it remains the grand paradigm. We simply haven't had anything replace it. And I see some wonderful, interesting articles that are trying to refute it. Lynn Margulis, who is famous, among other reasons, she was a very good biologist, but she was Carl Sagan's wife, first wife, actually. But Margulis had a variation on Darwin's theme that left a place for the kind of fused Lamarckian type evolutionary theory with Darwin's theory. It didn't have many supporters for it, but interestingly enough, today we are talking about something called epigenetics, which has to do with changes to the phenotype, the way you end up looking and behaving, that are attributable directly to what happens during gestation. So, next to be radicalized was physical anthropology, and that's no surprise. I mean, it was natural for physical anthropologists to say, look, we see the common body parts and the bone structures and what have you. You can draw a perfect descendancy here. To date, I think the only two, what they consider complete evolutionary lineages are for the horse and the goat, I believe. The hooves, they show perfect transitions. There's no supposed missing links or anything like that. But today, of course, we're not in the Darwinian era. We're in what we call the neo-Darwinian era. We appreciate our phenomena like punctuated equilibrium. It means you don't expect to see, hypothetically, you wouldn't expect to see, if, let's say 1,000 years from now, we happen to see in the future and all humans have a third arm sticking out of the middle of their chest. You wouldn't expect to see a bunch of fossilized people who were little stubs and then they kept getting longer and longer and longer and longer and longer. As near as we can tell, punctuated equilibrium is what happened when we went from quadruped to the biped way of locomoting. It just happened, and it's a mutation, as we'll come to find out. I'll talk very briefly about some of the characteristics of natural selection theory. It's always good to revisit those. And most recent to change are psychology and psychiatry. And I've had the privilege, I got my PhD in 1991, And in 1992, they published the first book, which is now considered the gospel of evolutionary psychologists. And like many cognitive neuroscientists, including Steven Pinker and others, I became an evolutionary psychologist as well. I'm still a neuroscientist, but we had to find an explanation. Why is the brain the same all over the planet? Prior to that, believe it or not, psychiatry and psychology was, well, they tended to think, and I say they tended because there are still some people left who believe this, the old guard. They believe that, well, evolution works well. In fact, I've met sociologists teaching at this university who've actually said this. Evolution explains, body parts and, why we have nose hairs and we have an eye on the left and an eye on the right and opposable thumbs, all those wonderful things. But they don't want to take the next leap and say, well, this organ called the brain is also evolved. But how else do you explain the fact that all humans on this planet see with the occipital lobes? We all have language, and all right-handers have language in the left hemisphere. It doesn't matter whether you're raised in Japan or Africa or in the West. It makes no difference. The brain sets up the same way. We are all unique at the same time, all right? And that's the trouble that they have. They want everybody to be so unique, right? And we are. Every one of you in this room is a mutant. Mutant, the science fiction guys like to call it. We're all mutations. There is no such thing as a normal human being or a normal jackrabbit. There's no such thing. We're all mutations. We're variations on the theme. Even identical twins, we're finding out now through epigenetics, are not purely identical twins. You're going to be talking about identical twins, I think, later.
He's reading his book for his talk. Yeah.
So
And there's epigenetics in it.
So I don't want to steal any of Dave's thunder, but we're virtually identical twins. Probably as identical as maybe two Hondas sold same year, same model, same color look, or something like that. Okay? We know there's subtle differences, and now that one will probably run 300,000 miles, and the other one will only make it 200,000 because of some quirk. All right? But the point is, we're virtually identical when it comes to identical twins, monozygotic twins. So in political science and sociology are now showing signs, just small signs of life. But there are some political scientists that are arguing, they've written books already, that are saying, look, the reason we are the way we are, politically, around the planet, for example, one of the universals we find around the planet is that in every society, even if you go to small African tribes or nomadic wanderers in sub-Saharan deserts, they have conservatives and they have a liberal group. And we know it has a lot to do with personality, and it's inherited. So one of the best guys in the political science domain is actually at the University of Chicago. Sociology, also there's an evolutionary sociology. I think there's only two guys, Sarah?
There's one.
One, but that's one.
The rest of it is when you were talking about misusing the word evolution.
Yeah, they misuse it, right.
One person using it.
1992 is that year that things really begin to shift. And here we are, this is the 20th anniversary of this new discipline. And about 50% of psychologists are on board. So, are we out of the woods yet? Well, regrettably not yet. The bad news is we may begin to de-evolve. There's no such thing as de-evolution. You don't go back. You don't regress. There are some mutations that actually are regressive. They don't typically take hold because they're not as suitable or adaptable as the current condition. But if we keep on this path, we're going to have to become something other than a couch potato, I think. I'm not sure what it'll be. I almost fear coming back to see this planet 100,000 years from now, if we're still alive, what we're going to look like. So,
With a diet, yeah.
so and you notice it's actually, I looked at it with a little thing, there's actually a McDonald's.
There is. You
You
can see
see
the
it?
yeah.
I actually got the class out last night. So, okay. I have a wonderful teacher at home that's because I used to ski quite a bit, and it shows the evolutionary path of skiing. And it starts out with this, this gorilla-like guy hunched over with skis and stuff, and the skis get better and better, and then it de-evolves to a snowboarder. So if you're a skier, snowboarders are your nemesis. So, anyway, this, if nothing else, if you log onto the internet and type in evolution of man, 3 simple words, you'll get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these images. For every discipline you can imagine, like I said, for skiers or for surfers, you name it, intellectuals. This one I picked it because it resonated with me because in this particular country, we have so much obesity. It's such a huge problem. Thank goodness that at least, what's her first name? Gail, Obama's wife. Michelle. I'm sorry. So, well, you had me thinking about the other gal that died yesterday or something. So, it wasn't Celine Dion that died.
Whitney Houston.
Whitney Houston. I care now. So. Okay, in any case, like I said, 50% of faculty are on board in my own department. And interestingly enough, the ones that are siding with me are the 2 or 3 new faculty, and then the older faculty are still kind of living in the dark ages, But they're going to be retiring in the next 3, 5, 10 years for most. So, and that's what Thomas Kuhn was talking about. That it takes a while for revolutions to take hold, and it often, sadly, ironically, has to do with just waiting for the old guard to die off. So, and that's a good sign. I used to tell my son that because of the way his grandfather, my father, was, and my father he was born in Florence, Italy, and it was the old way of thinking. I mean, he thought I would follow in his footsteps, because that's what you did. He became an engineer. His father, my grandfather, was a mathematician. And I was destined to go, and I got my appointment to the Air Force Academy, and then decided at the last minute, I discovered this thing called napalm. And I said, oh, no, that's not good. I don't like that kind of thing, so I'm not going to go to the Air Force Academy. And then I did it again to him. Years later, I got into medical school, and into the first year, I decided, nah, this isn't for me. Doctors work with sick people, and I can't take that. So I didn't discover that until I was actually doing rounds. So Dr. Cladd, bless him, but Dr. Cladd, who just passed away 8 years ago, told me, he says, well, Mark, because I told him one day, I said, they're all so sad. He says, Mark, why do people go to the doctor? I said, oh. And within a semester, I was at it. So I like research so much, I'm still doing it to this day. And interestingly enough, I was interested in neurosurgery, neurology, and I'm still doing that today, some of the brain work. The old guard are becoming the minority and dying off, and it is not because of progressive teachers like Dennett, Pinker, Stenger, Dawkins, Harris, Sam Harris, or myself, or anybody else. It's not us that are making a difference in these kids' lives today, or the public's lives. It has to do with this interesting little phenomenon. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Plato's allegory of the cave. It's probably a preeminent definition of enlightenment. Once you come out of that cave and you see the light, there is no going back. Not unless you have a major stroke, okay, and you lose all those brain cells. But there's no way to get rid of that knowledge. And interestingly enough, the whole Plato's stories when the enlightened one that saw the light goes back to the cave to try and tell everybody there, what happens? Anybody read it? Remember what happens? They try to kill him. Isn't that interesting? So Plato already understood, through almost 3,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, that there's a resentment built up out there in society, that people who like the old way of thinking are not progressives, are going to take it very personally. All right, so it's really another way I like to put it is that we just provide information, a bunch of facts, data. And that's the beauty of Darwin's theory, of course, is that when you look at these elegant, and I'm just going to talk about them very fast here, these 5 or 6 elegant premises, or let's say positions, postulates from the theory of natural selection, that you can't find a way around them. All right? I remember I grew up Catholic. And I remember, and my mom tells me to this day that I had a progressive Catholic for my catechism classes in high school, which is the first time I was introduced to the concept of the first cause. You were saying, was it 1955, the Presbyterians? In 1952, the Catholic Church, the Pope came out with this wonderful position and said, from now on, all Catholics are okay with evolutionary theory. Because, and he closes that whole paragraph, I read it once, and he closes it by saying, because correctly, he said, Darwin's theory explains the origin of new species. But in the beginning, there was God. And that's called the first cause argument among philosophers and theologians, that if you go further back, well, what created you? Well, it's my mom. Well, who created your mom? And you go further and further and further and further back, and you go back to the Neanderthals before us, and you go back to the other pre-Cro-Magnons until you get to the chimps, and then you get before that, you get monkey-tailed, only-tailed monkeys, because we still have residuals of our tail. Okay, it hurts when you fall on it once in a while, but we can trace our destiny back to that single-celled organism that probably evolved. Was the beginning of life probably happened. I'm one of those people who believes, the scientists who say it probably happened millions of times. It's just that a few of them managed to become, eventually, 1 billion years later, survive long enough as species to become multicellular life forms. Okay, but it took a long time for that to happen. But I had the privilege of having Stanley Miller as my genetics professor as an undergraduate at UCSD when they had stolen him away from Stanford. And for some of you may remember Stanley Miller. He's the guy who discovered with the flask, there was a vacuum, and he injected it with all the basic, 4 basic gases that are the building blocks of life, and then he zapped it with a bolt of electricity, just filled it full of a lightning bolt-like phenomenon. And 3 days later, there's no gas. It's all liquid, and then when you look at this brownish liquid, it's made up of amino acids, which are our genetic, instruction sets. So we know something about how life happens, but it's a natural process is the point. So you need mutations, and lots of them. So every time 2 people get together and form a union, they create a new variation. You've all seen those images of the cells ripping the chromosomes apart, and then they recombine. It's called recombinant unity. And in that recombination, you create a unique, that's why no 2 brothers and sisters, even though they're same mommies and daddies in many cases, they still come out looking very, very different. So, you need lots of variation to create new adaptations. This is it's kind of a stumbling block for a lot of people to appreciate that variation is important. Is one of the issues that a lot of sociologists and social psychologists have, on a few occasions I've debated with them, is that they think that evolutionary theory means that we're all the same. There's universals. Well, indeed, there are universals. If you look at any language on the planet, they all have nouns. Why? Because we have a need to name things. And they all have verbs, actions, all right, and things like that. So there are universals, but it doesn't mean that the languages can't differ. And Japanese sounds very different compared to English, obviously. So variation is important in the theory, according to Darwin, because that's where the new and better, potentially better forms come from. Doesn't mean that they're all better. Some of them, as we know, unfortunately don't work. They don't survive. Miscarriages are one of the classic ways that the body finds to expel, versions, mutations that just aren't going to be feasible in the long run. You need a vehicle to transmit the data, and of course that's called DNA. And that this is another interesting thing I think about Darwin's theory, is that it was going to be almost another 100 years before DNA is discovered by Francis Crick and Watson. Darwin was working at about the same time. He had a contemporary named Mendel. And Mendel was, of course, studying genetic transmission. So it's been food for thought, so to speak. People have speculated, well, if those 2 had actually met and had a chance to talk, who knows what would have come up far sooner. You need an environment that creates challenge. Okay, that's the part of the theory's name, natural selection. The natural environment does the selecting. The example I use with my students in classes, I say, imagine, weird science fiction, but imagine that all the big windows and doors suddenly get fused shut. And they're replaced by little portals, about a foot square. And that's the only way people can get in and out of buildings. So who's going to survive? Who gets selected for? Assuming that the environment did that naturally. Well, all small people, probably children, stuff like that. But we wouldn't live very long after that, because once we got to our normal sizes, we just simply couldn't get through those little portals. Okay. You need competition. This is, of course, the contribution from Thomas Malthus. And this is one of the issues that really doesn't sit well with a lot of people, especially religious people. But frankly, you can go to the Hassan School of Business, and that doesn't sit well there either. They believe in competition, and capitalists have competition, but they don't appreciate the issue of weeding out the weak, all right? And that's essentially what it does, is that the strongest forms survive, and the weaker ones, well, that's a big question right now, isn't it? My students in the fall evolutionary psychology class I teach, I had, just a few years ago, I had a gal who had a Down syndrome sister, yes. And she just started weeping in the middle of class when we were covering that topic of, well, what are we doing with modern medicine? We're allowing people to survive. Down syndrome people 50 years ago died in their teenage years because of the heart defect that is part of the syndrome. But today, we've taken care of that, and they're growing up, living full lives, having children and families, and keeping jobs and stuff. But these are people who weren't, prior to 50 years ago, they simply didn't exist beyond teenage years. And so obviously they didn't reproduce. And so we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing with modern technology if we're allowing anything and anyone to survive? I don't think there's, I dare say there's not a one of us in this room would say, oh, I'm going to prevent my children or my offspring from getting the best medical care possible. But it's keeping some of us, I should be dead because of something that happened to me a few years back. I should be dead. And probably, I'm guessing 50% of you should not be here today, had it not been for modern medicine. And many of you probably wouldn't have lived long enough to, prior to modern medicine, to create offspring. So many of our problems happens because of our own technology. And then lastly, you need extinctions. This is one of the, thanks to, this is part of the Neo-Darwinian platform. In the 1950s, it was that late, Theodosius Dobzhansky comes out with a Russian guy that comes out with this idea. He says, you know, you evolutionists keep forgetting, or we evolutionists, he said, keep forgetting that extinction is a normal part of the process. We tend to hide away from things we don't like. For example, forest fires. We think forest fires are a bad thing, but they're actually a part of the ecology, and we need them. And in fact, now modern foresters understand that you have to have these controlled burns to keep the forest healthy. So, all right. So I think this is pretty much about, knowledge versus belief. Oh, what does the knowledge do for us? What is it? Yeah, it is Charles Darwin. It takes a while to find out. So, but what does knowledge do? That's a big question. What does it do as opposed to belief? Is it legitimate that each of them are equal and fair? No, not at all. Knowledge neutralizes fear. How many of you right now are scared to death that you're going to go to the parking lot and you won't recognize your car? Or you'll stand in front of it and go, how do I get in it? How do you make it move? Well, you don't worry about that because you know. You have the knowledge. There's a key, you recognize your car, all these wonderful things. So knowledge has a way of neutralizing our fears. Right? Validates free and open discussions, as I said earlier. It's very resistant to dogma. Although we're prone to dogma. So even in scientific circles, we can have dogmatic positions and stuff. That's part of the entrenchment that prevents the new way of thinking. Einstein put up with this for 30 or 40 years. The resistance to indoctrination is another characteristic of having knowledge. Open your mind, let the knowledge do the rest. That's essentially what I was getting at earlier. That's what the Vic Stengers and the Steven Pinkers and Richard Dawkins do, and myself do for our students. We simply provide the knowledge and we let it do the work. And if it works its magic, it says reason is not magic, but if it works metaphorically, if it works its magic, students come out enlightened. In other words, we've helped them come out of the cave. And once they come out, they don't go back. I cannot tell you how many students I've had that, some of you met Britta, was here the other night with her son, and she's done the same thing with her son. But I've had many, many students over my short career that I watched the enlightenment happen. And it's not a transformation that happens on a single day, but it slowly starts to mature in them. And then after 6 months, and sometimes they come back to me 6 months later and say, I got it. It finally clicked. And I got to tell you, that's quite a privilege to live with. And I get that at least 3, 4, 5 times a year. It's just a wonderful experience. Enlightenment really means you don't need the mythology anymore. You're free from the thinking of the cave, so to speak. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way, it's just that it's older thinking. It's from a pre-scientific era. You have a question?
Actually, I just wanted to say that reminded me of this book. It was about a young woman in modern day society. She's Jewish and going back to she somehow got sent back to the Holocaust, and she knew it was going to happen, and all the other Jews didn't. And that sort of relates to this theory. Knowledge, without knowledge, there is no fear.
Yeah.
And that sort of, it contradicts it, because since she knew, she was scared, but all the others
Sure.
were just like, it's just gonna end. It's just-
Remember, that's also a hypothetical situation. We don't travel back in time, fortunately. Otherwise, we would cause a wreak havoc, at the very least. It's funny you mentioned the Holocaust, and I think this is a good example of universals. I had the privilege, I was invited to speak to a Jewish high school last week up in Denver, and when I got there, I was told these are what we call they're modern Orthodox Jews. In other words, the teaching is all done in English, not in Hebrew. But the girls and the boys weren't allowed to touch. The girls were over on one side, and the boys were on the other. And the point I'm making, though, is that I was talking about the environmental sustainability issue. And so I said, I showed them data, and I said, what do we do, guys? This is your future. We have 7 billion people and not enough planets to support them, and everybody wants to live the way we do. And so this one kid, Yodi, raises his hand off to the left-hand side, and he says, we could just have a big war and kill a bunch of them off. And I looked at him, I didn't know what to say at first. I didn't want to go to the Holocaust, so all I said was, there's a guy a few years ago that tried that, and it didn't set well with a lot of us, And then the teacher was like, and the principal So, turns out, I found out later, Yodi has attention deficit disorder. He just works out anything that's happening. But my point is, that's a universal. And he made a joke after, he goes, all those nuclear weapons are underutilized. Thank goodness. But here's a born-again Hitler in a Jewish community, in a manner of speaking, right? So it's universal to think in terms of solutions that work. And culling the herd is one way of doing that, sadly.
But isn't yours the saying, ignorance is bliss sometimes?
Yes.
Okay, so how do you defend knowledge in the face of her objection to knowledge?
Yeah.
Well,
What's so great about knowledge if you are fearful of dying? Well, why not be a dog who doesn't know they're going to die?
Yeah. Well, would you want, that's a good point.
I'm just...
The technology, the National Institutes of Aging is doing a lot of research that's telling us we can almost pinpoint when a person's going to die. Do you want to know that? There's a phenomenon in psychology called cognitive decline, also known as terminal drop. And it's on cognitive test scores, there's a real steep drop-off. And no one that's experienced that lives longer than 3 months. Do you tell the family? Everybody agrees, my students, it's one of the bioethical issues we talk about in class. No people dare to tell their family. So I think we have a sense of what ought to be talked about, what's legitimate, and what's, where's that dark zone, you just don't cross that line. So this is the last slide. Let me finish this up real quick then. So Darwin's irony, this is a nice place to end it, I think. The nature and biological basis of religion. There's a whole new area called neural theology today. And it's a thriving area of research. And what they're coming up with is the following. Now, we need religion because we seek explanations for what we believe is unexplainable. All right? Even atheists have to find a way of explaining the unexplainable. The unexplainable is, where do we come from? How did it all start? What was the beginning of the universe? And so, they go, well, at that point, there was some bang, or there was some this or some that, or there's a lot of interesting string theory has a different variation on the thing. The point is that they're not provable. In some cases, they're not provable. We haven't been there, couldn't videotape the Big Bang, for example. So we all rely to a degree on, I don't want to call it mythology, but ways of defining events that are, plausible to us at the time. So if you come back 100 years from now, string theory and quantum physics might even be irrelevant. There's a whole new better explanation. We also need religion because science won't tell us why we're here. That's a big issue with a lot of people. I'm in the camp, or the minority, that doesn't believe that. I think science does tell us why we're here, personally. And that meaning of life is reproduction. There's only one reason we're here, and that's to reproduce. Of course, if you have a nice life and you go to UU and you win the stock market or something like that, that's all nice. Bonus points, I guess, but it's not going to get you any further than anybody else. When you die, you're equal. So we fall back on it because it requires much less energy. And when I mean energy, I mean specifically mental energy. It just takes a lot less thinking to absorb, let yourself be indoctrinated, and watch a little video. Oh, wow. So that's what happened with that Moses guy, okay? He parted the sea and all this wonder. That's a neat, I like that kind of thing. So, but when you challenge the kids, and I've done this several times and had fun with this, so let's go back and talk about Noah a little bit. How many species are there? Can you imagine the size of the boat that would get 2 of all kinds in there? So, the power of group selection, this is why religion thrives still to this day. It's called group selection. There's some debate in evolutionary biology and in evolutionary psychology as to whether it's valid. But there is no question that people coming together, it's happening right here, people come together and they form some degree of unity and they survive that way. The Mormons have put this to the scientific level. They're thriving, and they're having lots and lots of children because they are extremely strong. My sister is Mormon, 35, 37 years now. Had 6 kids altogether, all girls, and she was the class salutatorian, and she was going to go up and be a marine biologist, and then she changed her mind, was going to be a doctor, and she ends up barefoot and pregnant and Mormon. And I asked her one time, I said, we used to have we had a kind of an intellectual family, and what happened? I finally had the gall to ask her one day, years ago, what happened? And she goes, Mark, I don't buy all the Mormon crap. She says, don't say that to Larry. But she says, what I like is community, their sense of community. She said, I just love that. When we grew up in San Diego, there was no such thing as community. Everybody was fending for themselves. It was dog eat dog kind of world, still is today. And let me close with this then. My favorite all-time quote from Bertrand Russell. Most people would rather die than think, and in fact, they do. And that's, I think, what we have. He was probably speaking to evolutionary theories. And look, having knowledge is better than not. So, well, that's it. That's all I got. If you got a question or two, I'll entertain it. Otherwise, let's have the cake.
Thank you, Mark. And we do have a few things to take care of before we serve the refreshments in the back. First of all, we are sharing our joys and concerns. If you have anything you want to tell us about, you can come up and say your name, take a stone and throw it in the water, and tell us what you want to say. If not, I'll just throw one stone for the...
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I'm just going to throw a stone for you.
This is a stone for Sherry Rogers. She's having some serious health issues, and please hold her in your hearts and prayers. We pray. And send her a card or give her a phone call. She needs a lot of support.
If there are no other joys or concerns, we'll put one more stone in for those that remain in our hearts. And we will, at this time, grateful for all that we receive from our religious community, mindful of all still needing to be done, we offer our generous support. I picked out a really cool reading, number 530, out of the stars, but I think we're going to skip it because we're running out of time. So we'll just, we'll extinguish the chalice, and then we'll have our fellowship circle. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. Those we carry in our hearts until we come together again.
Oops, oops. We're gonna break your stuff here.
I think it's all right.
Down and some of us are being stretched beyond our view.
Yes, right, yeah.
Who's going to start us off? Pat, will you start the singing?
Go now in peace, go now in joy, go now in spirit of love surround you. Let those come, love surround you, everywhere you may go.
Okay, here's the check for Johnny Floyd's. 4 credits.